In a Ukrainian field in 1965, a farmer digging a cellar hit something hard 2 meters down. It was not stone. It was a wall built entirely out of 95 mammoth skulls and leg bones, stacked and interlocked like a puzzle no one alive had ever solved before. Whoever built it had done something no human being had ever done at that latitude, in that cold, without a single tree in sight. The site was called Mezyrich, a small village in the Cherkasy region of central Ukraine. Soviet archaeologist Ivan Pidoplichko led the excavation through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and what he found beneath that farmer's cellar wasn't one structure. It was 4 circular dwellings, each built from the bones of dozens of woolly mammoths, arranged with a precision that looked less like desperation and more like architecture. There is a version of modern life that treats shelter as background noise. A door closes. A thermostat clicks somewhere behind drywall. Warm water travels through pipes to a tap without anyone thinking twice about it. A phone alarm goes off at 7. Inside 4 walls that have kept out weather every single night of that person's life, without a single close call, without a single genuine doubt about whether morning would come. Most people alive today have never once had to seriously ask whether they would survive the night. Not as an abstract fear, not as a bad dream, as an actual, current, unresolved question, with the answer still unknown at the moment the sun went down. That question was not rhetorical for most of human history. It was the first and most urgent question a person could ask. And for hundreds of thousands of years, the honest answer was, maybe not. No walls, no roof, no guarantee. Just weather, and whatever could be found, invented, or built before the temperature dropped. So how did ancient humans actually invent the house? Not the abstract idea of it, the physical, load-bearing, keep a person alive until morning structure. Where does that begin? Who built the first one? And what did it take to go from nothing overhead to a roof that could survive an ice age? The story does not begin with wood. It does not begin with stone. Either, it begins with fire. In a cave most people have never heard of, roughly 1.5 million years before anyone had the word house. Wonderwerk Cave sits in South Africa's northern Cape Province, 60 kilometers south of the town of Kuruman, on the edge of the Kalahari Desert. University of Toronto archaeologist Michael Chazan has led excavations there for years, working alongside Hebrew University's Leora Kolska-Horwitz. In 2012, their team published findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identifying burned bone and ashed plant remains a full kilometer deep inside the cave, far past any point a lightning-sparked wildfire could have reached on its own. The material dated to roughly 1 million years old. That number alone was a shock. It pushed the timeline for controlled fire use back 300,000 years earlier than anything previously confirmed. But the location mattered just as much as the date. A wildfire does not wander a kilometer into a pitch-black cave and set up camp. Something carried that fire in. Something kept it burning, on a cave floor scattered with the pellets of nesting barn owls, undisturbed for 1 million years. Consider what carrying fire a kilometer underground actually requires. Not a lighter, not a match. A burning branch or a smoldering coal kept alive against its will through darkness, across uneven stone, breathed on, fed, and protected the entire way in, and then tended once it arrived, fed small amounts of fuel, kept from either dying out or growing large enough to fill the chamber with smoke. That is not an accident. That is a skill. Practiced enough times to become reliable, passed from one person to another long before anyone could write the instructions down. So what happened next? Did that first fire settle the matter? It did not. In 2026, the same research team went back to even older sediment layers beneath the original find, using a new bone luminescence method. The kind of forensic technique usually reserved for crime labs. They identified fire traces dating to somewhere between 1.07 and 1.79 million years ago. Chazan told reporters he was comfortable putting the number at 1.7 to 1.8 million years. The species responsible wasn't Homo sapiens. It was Homo erectus, a full evolutionary chapter before anyone who looked like a modern human ever walked the earth. Here is where the assumption breaks. Most people picture the invention of shelter as something modern humans figured out. Clever, big-brained Homo sapiens solving a problem their ancestors couldn't manage. The truth runs in the opposite direction. Homo erectus was carrying fire into the dark, keeping it alive on a cave floor, roughly 1.5 million years before Homo sapiens existed at all. The first technology for making a hostile space livable predates our own species by more time than separates today from the invention of agriculture. Many times over, in fact. Fire alone did not make a cave a home. It made a cave survivable. Warmth, light, protection from anything with teeth that respected flame, that was the earliest technology of shelter, and it required no construction at all, just control and the discipline to keep something burning that wanted to go out on its own. Here's where it gets strange, though, because not every cave in this story was chosen for survival. Some were chosen for something closer to the opposite. 25 miles northwest of Johannesburg, inside a cave system called Rising Star, there is a chamber so difficult to reach that as of the most recent count, only 48 human beings have ever entered it. Paleoanthropologist Lee Berger, working with the University of the Witwatersrand, led the team that discovered it in 2013. After cavers reported bones glimpsed through a crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. What they eventually recovered was more than 1,500 fossil bones from at least 15 individuals of a previously unknown hominin species named Homo naledi, small-brained, standing a little over a meter tall, with a strange mix of primitive and startlingly modern anatomical features. Dating, published in 2017, placed the fossils at somewhere between 236,000 and 335,000 years old. That number matters because Homo naledi had a brain roughly a third the size of a modern human's, at a time when brain size was assumed to be the entire explanation for complex behavior. And then, in 2023, Berger's team made a claim that split the field in two. They argued that Homo naledi had deliberately carried bodies deep into the cave system, through chutes barely the width of a person's shoulders, far past any point that offered light, warmth, or shelter from weather, specifically to bury them. Alongside the burial features, they reported possible traces of fire deep in the chamber and engraved geometric markings on the cave walls near the passage. If true, it would mean a small-brained species had been navigating utter darkness, hundreds of meters underground, for a purpose that had nothing to do with survival at all. A ritual purpose, a symbolic one. Roughly 100,000 years before anything like it had ever been documented for any hominin, anywhere. Everyone assumes a claim this dramatic gets accepted once it clears peer review. It didn't. Later in 2023, a separate team of researchers published a rebuttal, arguing there was no convincing scientific evidence that the features were deliberate burials at all, and questioning whether the engravings could be reliably linked to Homo naledi rather than a later population of Homo sapiens who might have explored the same cave system afterward. The dispute is still unresolved. Nobody currently entering that chamber can say with certainty whether they are looking at the oldest known grave in the human story, or a chamber shaped by processes that only look like intention from a distance. What the Rising Star Cave does settle, regardless of how the burial question resolves, is this: caves were never simply convenient holes in the ground that ancient people stumbled into and warmed up inside. Some caves were sought out, explored, returned to, deliberately, past the point where any rational calculation of shelter or warmth could justify the trip. Long before anyone built a wall on purpose, some hominin species were already treating specific underground spaces as meaningful, dangerous to reach, difficult to leave, and worth the difficulty anyway. That single unresolved controversy is worth sitting with for a moment. Because it says something important about this entire subject, almost none of it is a closed case. Nearly every site in this story is still being argued about by the very people who study it most closely, right now, in real time. But control of fire only solves half the problem. A cave still has to exist in the first place, in exactly the right spot, with exactly the right shape, waiting to be found. Most of the ancient world did not offer that convenience. Most of the ancient world offered open ground, wind, rain, and nothing overhead but sky. So what happened once fire wasn't enough? Once the landscape didn't offer a cave at all? That question gets answered on a beach in the south of France, roughly 600,000 years later, a stretch of coastline that would one day become one of the most expensive addresses in Europe. In January of 1966, construction crews preparing to build an apartment block on the slopes of Mount Boron, above the port of Nice, uncovered something buried in what had once been a prehistoric beach terrace. French prehistorian Henri de Lumley was given from January 28th to July 5th of that year to excavate before the building went up. His team worked 7 days a week. Near the end, they worked around the clock, racing the construction schedule. What they found became known as Terra Amata, dated to roughly 400,000 years ago. The site sat on a beach that in the Ice Age stood about 26 meters above the current level of the Mediterranean. De Lumley identified more than 24 separate living surfaces layered on top of each other, evidence, he argued, of a group that returned to this exact spot on the beach, again and again, season after season, possibly for generations of the same families. At the center of what he interpreted as oval-shaped huts, each one built from branches driven into the sand and bent inward toward the middle, there was a hearth, a shallow bed of pebbles, blackened by fire, protected from the sea wind by the hut's own walls. De Lumley's team found ash there that had not moved in 400,000 years. In some layers, the surrounding vegetation record showed ash, alder, and willow trees near the coast, with oak and pine further up the slopes of Mont Boron, meaning the people who camped at Terra Amata had a choice of building materials nearby, and chose to build with what the beach itself provided. 400,000 years is difficult to hold in the mind at all. It is roughly 2,000 times longer than the entire span of recorded human writing. It is longer than Homo sapiens itself has existed as a species, by a wide margin. And on that beach, someone drove branches into wet sand, lit a fire inside the resulting windbreak, and sat down to nap stone tools in the glow of it, close enough to the flame to see what their hands were doing after the sun went down. The huts de Lumley described were not large. Most reconstructions placed them at somewhere between 8 and 15 meters long, oval in shape, built from branches anchored by a rough perimeter of stones and driftwood, with the hearth positioned carefully enough to be shielded from the wind coming off the water. This was not a random pile of debris. It was a floor plan, repeated on the same stretch of sand across dozens of separate visits. Everyone assumes a find like this settles the question the moment it comes out of the ground. It doesn't. In 1983, archaeologist Paola Villa published a reanalysis of Terra Amata's stone tools, tracking how artifacts had physically shifted vertically through the sediment layers over 400 millennia of geological movement, soil compaction, water infiltration, and the slow churn of 400,000 years of weather working on loose sand. Her conclusion complicated de Lumley's tidy picture of 27 distinct hut floors. The site's depositional history, she argued, was far messier than a simple stack of seasonal campsites, and some of what looked like separate huts may have been the same living surface, disturbed and redisturbed over time. That controversy is not a weakness in the story, it's the story. Even 400,000 years later, with ash still sitting where it fell. Working out exactly what ancient people built and how deliberately they built it requires argument, re-excavation, and researchers willing to challenge each other's conclusions in print decades apart. The house's origin story has never been simple, and it was never going to be settled by one team, one excavation, or one summer of digging on the French coast. Here's where it gets strange, though, because Terra Amata was not an outlier. It was one data point in a much older, much stranger pattern that stretches back further than most people realize. The oldest disputed claim for constructed shelter goes back even further than the French Riviera. In Japan, on a hillside near Chichibu, north of Tokyo, researchers uncovered what appeared to be post holes with well-defined edges, cut into a layer just above volcanic ash, dated using Japanese techniques that Harvard anthropologist Ofer Bar Yosef has described as generally reliable. If the interpretation holds, the site could push the record for artificial structure back further than Terra Amata itself, built by an even earlier population of Homo erectus using stone tools. The claim remains debated among the archaeologists who specialize in East Asian prehistory, and it has never been fully resolved either way. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the science. It is what real science looks like when it is working exactly as intended. A slow, contested, self-correcting argument. Not a single triumphant discovery that ends the conversation. But there's a problem with treating Terra Amata as the end of this chapter. It wasn't. Something else was happening at almost the same time, built by a species that has spent most of modern history being underestimated. In February of 1990, a 15-year-old boy named Bruno Kowalczewski spent 3 years clearing rubble from a rockslide that had sealed the entrance to a cave in France's Aveyron Valley, chasing faint wisps of air his father had noticed escaping from the scree. What he eventually opened was a passage so tight that only the thinnest cavers in the local club could squeeze through it. 336 meters into that cave, well over a fifth of a mile from the entrance, deep past any point where daylight has ever reached, cavers found a chamber where dozens of stalagmites had been deliberately broken and arranged. Archaeologist Jacques Joubert of the University of Bordeaux led the team that finally dated the structures properly, publishing in the journal Nature in 2016. Using uranium-thorium dating on stalagmite regrowth that had formed over the broken pieces after construction, his team established an age of 176,500 years, with a margin of error of only about 1,100 years either direction. More than 400 stalagmites had been snapped off, moved, and stacked into 2 ring-shaped structures, the larger measuring roughly 6.5 meters across, with some pieces deliberately propped upright against the rings, apparently for reinforcement. Traces of fire were found directly on top of the structures themselves, not simply nearby on the cave floor. The species responsible was not Homo sapiens. Modern humans would not reach this part of Europe for well over 100,000 years. The only hominins in the region at that time were Neanderthals, long caricatured in the popular imagination as brutish and incapable of complex planning. Jobert's team argued the opposite. Reaching a chamber a fifth of a mile underground, in total darkness, required carrying fire the entire way, exactly like the fire carried into Wonderwerk Cave over 1,000,000 years earlier. It required enough advanced planning to bring extra fuel for the return trip, and once there, it required a coordinated, collective effort to break stalagmites of specific sizes and arrange them into a deliberate, regular geometric pattern, rather than a random pile. Everyone assumes Neanderthals were simple survivalists, capable of little beyond hunting and basic toolmaking. Wonderwerk Cave argues otherwise. As Jobert's team put it directly in their published findings, the site's complexity and its difficult, deliberate access speak of human industry and suggest an organized society already moving toward what researchers now describe as behavioral modernity, 136,000 years before anyone had previously documented anything like it for this species. What the rings were actually for remains completely unknown. Not a hearth ring for warmth, the location is far too deep, too remote from any entrance, for casual habitation. Not an obvious shelter from weather, since cave-deep, level, dry ground of that kind offered no threat from wind or rain in the first place. The purpose is, in the researchers' own words, still conjectural. But the fact of it, this deep, this early, this technically demanding, closes off any comfortable assumption that deliberate construction was something only modern humans figured out how to do. So what changed between a beach windbreak on the Riviera and a bone-built dome on the Ukrainian steppe? The climate did, and that brings the story back to Mezirich, and to the coldest, most extreme building material human beings have ever chosen: the skeletons of the animals they hunted. By around 18,000 years ago, the figure comes from a 2025 radiocarbon revision published by archaeologist Wei Chu of Leiden University and colleagues, using more precise dating methods on smaller mammal remains found alongside the structures. The people living along the Dnieper River basin in what is now Ukraine faced a problem nobody on a French beach ever had to solve. There were no trees. The last glacial maximum had turned much of the region into a treeless steppe, cold enough to kill, with none of the traditional building material within reach for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. What they had instead was mammoth. At Mezirich, Pito Plichko's team uncovered 4 separate circular structures, the largest measuring roughly 7 meters across, built from the bones of dozens of mammoths, skulls stacked to form load-bearing walls, tusks arched overhead, leg bones wedged and interlocked with a level of structural planning that still impresses engineers who study it today. One dwelling included a distinct fence-like arrangement made entirely of mammoth bone, built with no apparent function beyond organizing space. An early hint that shelter was starting to mean more than survival. It was starting to mean order. This wasn't improvisation. This was engineering, built from the only large, rigid material available on a landscape that offered nothing else. A single adult mammoth skull can weigh well over 100 kilograms. Moving dozens of them, stacking them into a stable, load-bearing wall that could hold its shape through wind, snow, and the weight of a hide roof took planning that had to happen before a single bone was placed. There was no margin for error in a build like that. A wall of stacked bone that collapsed under snow load in the middle of an Arctic winter night was not a minor construction failure. It was a potential death sentence for everyone sleeping inside. Whoever designed these structures had almost certainly failed before, on earlier, cruder attempts elsewhere along the Dnieper basin, and carried that knowledge forward into a design precise enough to still be standing, mostly intact, 18,000 years later. And it worked. People lived, cooked, slept, and likely told stories inside walls made from the animals that had, in an earlier and more brutal sense, tried to kill them. Everyone assumes these mammoth bone circles were simply houses, cold weather engineering. Plain and practical, case closed. For decades, most archaeologists took exactly that for granted. But newer research, including analysis published as recently as 2025 by Chu's team, has reopened the question of whether every one of these structures was actually a dwelling at all. Some may have functioned as food caches, taking advantage of the deep cold to preserve meat through the winter. Some may have been something closer to a monument or a ritual site, a deliberate arrangement of bone that said something about the people who built it, beyond simply keeping the wind out. Nobody disputes that people lived at Mezirich. Storage pits, fire pits, flint tools, and a fragment of mammoth tusk carved with markings that may represent the oldest known map found anywhere in Ukraine were all recovered scattered through the site. But the line between shelter and something more than shelter was already blurring. 18,000 years before anyone built a temple on purpose. And Mezirich was not the only site of its kind. Roughly 300 kilometers to the west, in the Plava Hills of southern Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, a settlement called Dolní Věstonice tells a similar story with an even stranger twist. Czech archaeologist Bohuslav Kilma led major excavations there beginning in 1952, uncovering a Pavlovian culture settlement dated to roughly 29 to 27,000 years ago. Older than Mezirich by close to a decade of scholarship's worth of dating revisions, and colder in some ways, sitting near the fringe of the ice sheets during the run-up to the last glacial maximum. Kilma identified as many as 5 or 6 separate hut structures at the site, each associated with its own hearth and mammoth bone concentration. By his estimate, each hut may have housed 20 to 25 people, which would put the total population of the settlement, at its peak, somewhere around 100 to 120 individuals. A scale of organized cold weather, living that most people never associate with the deep ice age. And here is the detail that turns Dolní Věstonice from an engineering story into something closer to a human one. Among the material Kilma's team recovered was a small fired clay figurine of a woman, just over 11 centimeters tall, now known as the Venus of Dolní Věstonice. It is one of the oldest known ceramic objects made by human hands anywhere in the world, fired deliberately in a kiln alongside animal figurines, at a settlement built from mammoth bone on the edge of survivable cold. People were not simply staying alive at Dolní Věstonice. They had enough stability, enough surplus attention to fire clay into art. Firing clay requires more than an open flame. It requires understanding that raw, wet clay will shatter if heated too quickly, that a kiln needs a controlled temperature held steady over time, and that the entire process can fail completely and produce nothing but broken shards. Someone at Dolní Věstonice had learned that lesson already, roughly 27,000 years before pottery is traditionally assumed to have been invented anywhere else in the archaeological record. That knowledge did not appear by accident. It appeared because people had the shelter, the fuel, and the time to fail at something repeatedly until they got it right. That single fact reframes everything that came before it. Shelter was never only the endpoint of this story. It was the precondition for everything that came after, for craft, for ritual, for the earliest sparks of culture that had nothing directly to do with staying warm. But not every mammoth bone structure fits neatly into this picture of home and hearth. And the clearest example of that comes from a site that on the surface looks exactly like Mezirich and Dolní Věstonice, until someone actually tries to live in it. In 2014, archaeologists working at Kostenki, along the Don River just south of the Russian city of Voronezh, uncovered the largest mammoth bone structure ever found. Led by Alexander Pryor of the University of Exeter, the team identified a circular arrangement, roughly 12.5 meters across, nearly 40 feet, built from an estimated 2,982 individual bones, belonging to the remains of at least 64 separate mammoths. Dated to approximately 25,000 years ago, it was, at the time of discovery, the oldest and largest structure of its kind ever recorded in the region. 64 mammoths is not a number that comes from a single hunt, or even a single season. Assembling that much bone meant either an extraordinary run of successful hunts stretched across years, or the deliberate scavenging of animals that had died from other causes and been collected, one carcass at a time, from wherever they were found across the surrounding landscape. Either way, someone was tracking, gathering, and hauling an immense quantity of raw material to one specific spot on the Russian plain, long before the structure itself was ever assembled. And it broke the pattern completely. Kostenki 11 also seems too large to be a dwelling, Pryor told reporters after the excavation. It is difficult to imagine how an area this large could be roofed over using materials available in this environment. Using flotation, a technique that separates tiny organic fragments from soil using water and fine sieves. A method not available to earlier excavators at nearby sites decades before. Pryor's team found the density of domestic debris inside the structure was far lower than expected for a space that had been intensively lived in. Some of the mammoth bones still had cartilage and fat attached when they were stacked into place, which would have created a smell capable of drawing wolves and foxes directly to the site. A serious problem if people were actually meant to sleep there. So what was it for, if not shelter? Pryor's team found charred wood, burned bone, and fragments of soft plant tissue resembling roots and tubers, hints of food processing, possibly food storage, taking advantage of the structure's mass and the surrounding permafrost to preserve meat through brutal winters. But they also acknowledged something else entirely. It clearly meant something to them. Pryor said. And there was very likely a ritual element to it, even if the structure ultimately had some sort of practical purpose too. Nearly 40 feet of stacked mammoth bone, built by hunter-gatherers surviving temperatures that could reach 20 degrees below zero. And nobody, not the archaeologists who excavated it, not the researchers who have studied it since, can say with full confidence whether it was a house, a pantry, or a monument. Sometimes the real weapon of a discovery isn't a clean answer. It's the honest admission that the ancient world built things for reasons that don't sort neatly into modern categories, like house, warehouse, and temple. Those categories may simply not have existed yet. That bone architecture, whatever its full purpose, was engineering pushed to its absolute limit, the maximum a small mobile group could achieve, using only what they carried and what they killed. But somewhere else, at almost exactly the same moment in deep time, a different kind of building was happening. One built not for storage, and not for ritual, but for the single, narrowest purpose of keeping one specific group of people alive through one specific, brutal season. 23,000 years ago, in the Thessaly region of central Greece, temperatures during the last glacial maximum dropped low enough outside a cave called Theopetra to kill an unsheltered person within hours. Archaeologist Nina Kiparisi Apostolika has led excavations at Theopetra Cave since 1987, and among the finds inside is a stone wall built to partially seal the cave's entrance, deliberately constructed, researchers argue, to block the wind pouring down off the surrounding mountains during the coldest stretch of the last ice age. It is currently dated to roughly 23,000 years old, which places it among the oldest confirmed human-built structures anywhere in the archaeological record. Not a full house, not 4 walls and a roof, but a targeted, purposeful intervention against a specific named threat. Cold that could kill. A wind that had already ended other lives that same winter, in that same cave system, in the memory of the people who decided to build. Theopetra itself was already a favorable location. A natural limestone cave, dry, defensible, used intermittently by people for tens of thousands of years before that wall was ever built. But a cave mouth open to the elements is still a cave mouth open to the elements. The wind that funnels down off the surrounding Thessalian mountains during a glacial winter does not politely stop at the entrance. It was the difference between a cave that merely existed nearby and a cave that could actually be survived in. And someone at Theopetra understood that difference well enough to do something about it with nothing but loose stone and the will to stack it. That is the piece almost every version of this story leaves out. A house is not first and foremost a place to live. It is a device for arguing with weather and winning, sometimes by building a whole structure from scratch, and sometimes by adding just one wall to a shelter nature had already half provided. So what turned that argument into something permanent? Something that stayed built after the people who built it had moved on, or married, or had children, or died? That answer arrives roughly 10,000 years ago, and it arrives in reverse order from what most people would guess. Beginning in 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt led excavations at a hilltop site in southeastern Turkey called Bekli Tepe, near the modern city of Unlurfa. What his team uncovered were massive circular stone enclosures, built between roughly 9600 and 8200 BC, containing T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 10 tons, carved with images of lions, boars, foxes, snakes, and vultures. For most of the 20th century, archaeology's accepted sequence ran in one direction only. Humans settled down, invented farming, built permanent villages, and only then, with food to spare and stable populations, did they develop the social organization needed to build anything monumental. Everyone assumes agriculture came first and architecture came after, a reward for finally growing enough food to stop moving. Göbekli Tepe says otherwise. Schmidt found no domesticated grain at the site, no pottery in the earliest layers, no clear evidence that anyone lived there permanently at all. What he found was a monumental structure built by people who were still hunting wild game and gathering wild plants, hunter-gatherers investing enormous, coordinated labor into stone architecture centuries, possibly close to a millennium, before farming existed anywhere nearby in the Fertile Crescent. Schmidt summarized the implication in 5 words that rewired an entire field. First came the temple, then the city. The order everyone assumed, settle down, then farm, then build something permanent, may have run backward. The desire to build something monumental, something communal, something that meant more than shelter, may be what pulled scattered groups of people toward settled life in the first place, not the other way around. Consider the physical scale of what that required. A single T-shaped pillar weighing up to 10 tons had to be cut from limestone bedrock using only stone tools, dragged or levered across open ground with no wheel and no draft animals, then carved with detailed reliefs of specific animals, and finally raised upright into a socket cut to hold it steady. Doing that once would represent a serious undertaking for a small community. Göbekli Tepe's enclosures contain dozens of these pillars. That level of labor only makes sense if groups of people were already committing to return to the exact same hill, season after season, coordinating with other bands who may have traveled from considerable distances to help, long before any of them had crops to justify staying, and long before anyone owed anyone else a harvest. Recent excavation seasons have complicated even that picture further. More recent fieldwork has turned up domestic structures, a water supply system, and tools associated with everyday domestic use, suggesting some residents may eventually have stayed at Göbekli Tepe more permanently than Schmidt first believed, even if his original insight about the sequence of temple before farming still holds. The debate, like every debate in this story, is still active, still being argued over in journals and excavation seasons right now, decades after the site was first uncovered. So what happened once people finally did stay in one place year-round? Not for a temple on a hilltop, but for daily life, permanently, for the first time in the human story. That answer arrives in the Jordan Valley, at a site now called Tel Es Sultan, better known by the name of the modern town nearby, Jericho. British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon led excavations there from 1952 to 1958, digging deep stratified trenches that exposed more than 12,000 years of continuous layered occupation. What her team found at the deepest levels was a group known as the Natufians, hunter-gatherers who began gathering seasonally at Jericho around 10,000 beats, drawn back again and again by the Ain as Sultan Spring, one of the only reliable year-round water sources in an otherwise punishing, arid landscape. For over 1,000 years, they came and went with the seasons. The same pattern of temporary return that had defined Terra Amata 400,000 years earlier, just compressed into a much shorter cycle. Then, around 9600 BC, the climate shifted. The brutal cold snap known as the Younger Dryas ended. The world warmed into the period geologists now call the Holocene, and at Jericho. Something changed that had never quite happened before at this specific spot. People stopped leaving. By roughly 8000 BC, Kenyon's excavations revealed a settlement enclosed by a stone wall at least 5 feet thick, paired with a tower nearly 8.5 meters tall, built with an internal staircase of 22 stone steps, constructed using nothing but stone tools. No metal, no wheel. None of the technology that would define later civilizations. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by more than 5,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by roughly the same margin, and it was raised by a population that likely numbered only a few hundred people. Everyone assumes a wall that thick and a tower that tall must have been built purely for defense, a fortification against raiders. Plain and simple. Kenyon herself argued exactly that, but the debate over the tower's true purpose has never fully closed. Other researchers have proposed the structure may have served a ritual function, or even acted as a marker tied to seasonal flooding from the nearby wadi, its staircase leading not to a lookout point for scanning the horizon for enemies, but to a place for community gathering or observation of the sky. Much like Göbekli Tepe's carved pillars, much like the Kostenki bone circle that still divides its own excavators, the Tower of Jericho refuses to resolve neatly into a single, tidy modern category. What is not disputed is the scale of the commitment. Circular mud brick homes clustered around that tower and wall, built and rebuilt on the same footprint across generations, layer stacked on layer, the same family's descendants living and dying on the same small patch of ground for centuries at a stretch. Each time a mud brick wall crumbled or a roof gave out, instead of moving somewhere else entirely, the next generation simply built again, directly on top of the last collapse, compressing centuries of rebuilding into the layered mound archaeologists now call a tell. This is widely regarded as the oldest continuously inhabited settlement location on Earth, a place people have kept returning to and rebuilding on for roughly 11,000 years, through empires, through conquests, through the entire span of written history. Because a spring kept producing water in a spot on the map that people, once a very long time ago, decided was worth never fully leaving again. That is the last piece of the sequence, and it completes something that started 1.5 million years earlier with a fire kept alive in a South African cave. Fire made a place survivable for a night. A windbreak on a French beach made a place survivable for a season, revisited again and again. Bone architecture on a treeless steppe made survival possible through an entire Ice Age winter. A single wall in a Greek cave made the difference between freezing and living through one specific brutal stretch of cold. Stone pillars on a Turkish hilltop turned a place into something worth returning to for reasons that had nothing to do with weather at all. And at Jericho, all of it finally collapsed into permanence. A wall, a tower, and homes rebuilt on the same ground for 11,000 consecutive years. That is the real answer, buried underneath the obvious one. The obvious answer to how did ancient humans invent houses is a simple checklist: fire, then walls, then bone, then stone, then permanence, in a tidy line from cave to condo. The real answer is that shelter was never only about keeping weather out. From a fire kept alive a kilometer into a South African cave, to a hominid species carrying its own dead deep into darkness, for reasons still argued about today, to a windbreak on a French beach still holding its own argument 400,000 years later, to a bone circle built where no trees grew, to another bone circle so large nobody can agree what it was for, to a single wall raised against a killing wind, to 10-ton carved pillars raised by people who hadn't yet planted a single seed, to a tower and a wall that a small population kept rebuilding on the exact same ground for 11,000 consecutive years. Every stage of this story is about a group of people deciding that a specific place mattered enough to defend, to return to rebuild after it fell down. The house was never really the point. The commitment to a place was the point. The house was just the proof of it. There is something worth sitting with in how long this took, and how uneven the timeline actually is. 1.5 million years passed between the first controlled fire and the first deliberate wall. Then, only a few 100,000 years between that wall and a bone dome built on a treeless steppe. Then, barely 10,000 years between the bone dome and a tower with a staircase inside it. The pace was not steady. It accelerated unevenly in fits and starts, exactly the way most real technological history actually moves. Long plateaus of almost nothing changing, followed by sudden, disproportionate leaps, usually forced by climate, by hunger, by cold that would otherwise kill. Nobody who built any of these structures thought of themselves as inventing the house. There was no blueprint passed down, no single genius who solved it once and handed the answer to everyone else. There was only a series of specific, local, desperate, and occasionally beautiful decisions, made by people responding to the exact conditions in front of them, using exactly the materials their landscape happened to offer. A Homo erectus band with nothing but a cave and the discipline to keep a coal alive. A group on a French beach with driftwood, sand, and enough returning visits to wear the same living surface into the ground 27 times over. Hunter-gatherers on a Ukrainian steppe with nothing to build from but the bones of the animals they had just killed. A handful of families in a Greek cave with nothing but loose stone and a wind that was actively trying to end them. A community on a Turkish hilltop who decided, before they had ever planted a single seed, that some places deserved a monument. And a small population beside a single spring in the Jordan Valley who simply, one year, chose not to leave, and then kept choosing that, generation after generation, for 11,000 years running. Picture that Ukrainian field again. 95 mammoth bones, stacked by hand, by people who had never seen a tree and never would, wedged into a wall that held for 18,000 years until a farmer's shovel found it by accident. They were not primitive. They were solving the hardest engineering problem their environment could offer, with nothing but bone, precision, and each other. The same three ingredients that 23,000 years ago in a Greek cave, and 10,000 years ago on a Turkish hilltop, and 11,000 years ago beside a spring in the Jordan Valley, kept showing up again and again, long before anyone had a word for architecture at all. Every wall since, glass towers, cul-de-sacs, apartment blocks stacked 20 stories into the sky over cities that did not exist 10,000 years ago, is a distant descendant of that same impulse. Somewhere in the deep, cold dark, someone decided a specific patch of ground was worth defending, and built something that would still be standing long after they themselves were gone. Most people alive today will never build the walls they sleep inside tonight. They will never fell the tree, stack the bone, or quarry the stone. The decision has already been made for them, generations deep, by people who are not around to be thanked. The first house was never really made of wood or stone or bone. It was made of the decision to stay.